She was already turning the bolt when she heard it. 3 hard knocks. Not a knock. A fist. Desperate. Urgent. The kind that doesn't ask permission. Rowan's hand froze on the latch. Outside, the Montana winter was trying to kill everything it touched. Wind screaming down the ridge. Snow so thick you couldn't see the fence line 10 feet from the porch. And here, at near midnight, someone was pounding on the door of a woman who lived alone on a mountain that most people had given up finding. She grabbed the shotgun off the hook. If that door swung open to the wrong kind of man, and there were plenty of wrong kinds out here, her night was about to get a whole lot worse than lonely. But then she heard it. Underneath the howling wind, underneath the pounding fist, a child crying. Before we go any further, if you've ever had to make a split-second decision that changed the entire course of your life, you're going to feel every word of this story in your bones. Subscribe right now and hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one. And when we're done here, drop a comment and tell me, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to that door. The shotgun was cold in Rowan Ashford's hands. Everything in her cabin was cold lately. The iron stove worked twice as hard just to keep the pipes from freezing. And most nights she went to bed fully dressed because the extra layer of wool between her body and the dark was the closest thing to comfort she had. She was 34 years old and had been alone on this land for 2 winters now, and she had learned, the hard way, through the particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself, but just moves in and rearranges all the furniture of your life, that aloneness and loneliness are 2 entirely different animals. She didn't mind being alone. She minded being afraid. And right now, with 3 inches of solid pine door between her and whoever was standing in that blizzard, Rowan Ashford was afraid. She pressed her back against the wall beside the doorframe, the way her father had taught her when she was barely old enough to hold a rifle. Don't stand in front of it. Don't give them a silhouette. She angled herself so she could pull the latch without becoming a target, and she waited. The pounding came again, harder this time. Then a man's voice, rough, strained, the words almost eaten by the wind. "Please, I've got a boy. He can't." The sentence broke apart. She couldn't tell if the wind took the rest of it or if the man had simply run out of what it took to keep going. The child's cry again. Thin, high, exhausted in the specific way that made something in Rowan's chest contract like a fist closing. She swore under her breath, quietly, the way her grandmother used to swear, not for emphasis, just for the honest expression of a hard situation. Then she opened the door. The cold hit her like a physical thing, not just temperature but force, a wall of mountain winter that had been building itself up for hours and was now pushing through every gap in the frame. Snow came with it, horizontal and mean, and for one lurching second she couldn't see anything at all. Then the snow shifted and she saw them. The man was tall. That was the first thing. Tall and broad through the shoulder in the way that usually reads as threatening, but right now just looked like a body working too hard to stay upright. He had his coat, a good coat, she noticed, even through the white chaos, wrapped around something he was holding against his chest. One arm cradled the bundle. The other hand was braced against her doorframe, and even in the dark she could see that his fingers were wrong. Too still, too white at the tips. He was looking at her. His face was a mess. There was blood at his temple, dark and iced over, and his left eye was swollen half shut. He'd been hit. Or he'd fallen. Either way, whatever had happened to him had happened a while ago, and he'd been walking through a Montana blizzard with a head wound and a child in his arms since then. "I'm not," he started, then stopped, his jaw working. "I'm not going to hurt you." It was such a desperate, obvious thing to say. The kind of thing only an actually desperate person says, because anyone trying to trick you would have come up with something smoother. Rowan's eyes dropped to the bundle in his arms. The coat shifted, and she saw a small face. The boy couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. His eyes were closed, and his lips had that bluish tinge that meant she had about 20 minutes before this became a different kind of emergency. She stepped back from the door. "Get in," she said. "Now, before I change my mind." The man moved fast, faster than she expected from someone who looked like he was held together by sheer stubbornness. and she swung the door shut behind them and threw the bolt in one practiced motion. Then she turned around with the shotgun still in her hands, pointed at the floor, but not forgotten, and she looked at the two of them standing in her entryway, dripping ice melt onto the floorboards. "Set the boy down on the rug," she said, "closer to the stove." "Thank you," the man said. His voice was different now, without the wind trying to swallow it. Quiet, controlled, in a way that didn't quite match the state of his face. Thank you. Don't thank me yet." She nodded at the rug. "The boy first." He carried the child to the braided rug in front of the stove and set him down with more care than Rowan had expected. The boy stirred, made a small sound that wasn't quite a word, and curled into himself. The man crouched over him, checking him the way someone checks a person they know, touching his cheek, his hands, the pulse at his wrist. Not panicked, methodical. And something about the steadiness of those hands in the midst of everything else struck Rowan as strange. "What's his name?" she said. "Eli." The man didn't look up. "He's mine. He's 8. She put the shotgun across the kitchen table, not away, just accessible, and went to the trunk under the window for blankets. She brought 3. The man took them without asking and began tucking them around the boy with the particular efficiency of someone who had done this before, layering them, checking the boy's fingers, talking low. "Eli, hey buddy, you're inside now. You're warm. Come on, open your eyes." The boy's eyes opened, dark, uncertain. He looked at the man first, at his father, and something in his small face unlocked. "Are we okay?" he said. His voice was tiny, waterlogged with cold and exhaustion. "We're okay," the man said. "This lady let us in." Eli looked at Rowan then, looked at her for a long moment with the particular, unguarded directness of a child who doesn't yet know he should pretend not to stare. "You have a lot of guns," he said. Rowan looked around her cabin. He wasn't wrong. "I live alone," she said, "and I'm not stupid." Eli seemed to think about this. Then he nodded, as though it made complete sense, and pulled the blanket tighter under his chin. "What?" She made the man sit at the table while she heated water. He didn't argue, which told her the adrenaline was wearing off, and his body was beginning to insist on being listened to. She brought a cloth and a bowl of warm water and set them in front of him without being asked. "The wound at your temple needs cleaning," she said. He touched it, almost like he'd forgotten it was there. Winced. "I've had worse," he said. "That's not what I asked." She sat across from him. "Who are you?" He looked at her. He had gray eyes. She noticed it now in the lamplight. The kind of gray that isn't soft but isn't hard either. The kind that watches things carefully and doesn't give much away. "Silas," he said. "Silas Granger." "Where are you coming from, Silas Granger?" "North Pass." She blinked. "That pass has been closed since Thursday." "I know. A person gets turned around up there in this kind of weather. They don't come out." She kept her voice even. "You came from the North Pass carrying an 8-year-old boy in a blizzard with a head wound." "Yes." "Why?" The pause before he answered was a fraction too long. "We were moving south," he said. "Storm came faster than expected." It wasn't a lie, exactly. She'd learned, from her father, from her late husband, from 2 years of reading people on a mountain where people didn't come unless they had a reason, that the most dangerous untruths aren't the outright ones. They're the ones that are mostly true with a small, crucial part missing. She didn't push. Not yet. The boy was still blue-lipped and the man's fingers were still too white at the tips, and there was a storm making the walls of her cabin flex like something alive outside. And none of those problems got better by her demanding answers at midnight. "You can take the cot by the stove," she said. "The boy can have it. You take the chair." "I'm not going to sleep," he said. "I know you're not. Neither am I." She stood up. "But your boy is. And you're going to sit there quietly and let him, and in the morning, when the storm breaks, you're going to tell me exactly what you're running from and why you were on a closed mountain pass in the worst blizzard this valley's seen in 20 years. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Nobody is," she said. Get that cloth on your head before it scars worse. She did not sleep. She sat in the high-backed chair by the window with the shotgun across her knees, and the lamp turned low, and she watched the man who called himself Silas Granger watch over his son. He'd cleaned the wound at his temple, not perfectly the way a surgeon might, but efficiently, like a person working in dim light with limited resources who had done it before. He'd stripped off the outer layer of his coat, and she'd seen beneath it that the shirt underneath was quality, not frontier quality, city quality. Fine-stitched and cut for a body that was accustomed to having things fit. She filed this away. He sat beside his son for over an hour without moving, his forearms on his knees, his head bowed. Sometimes his lips moved. She couldn't hear what he said. She wasn't trying to. There's a privacy to a man speaking quietly to a sleeping child that even a suspicious woman in her own home shouldn't intrude on. Around 2 a.m, Eli startled awake from what must have been a bad dream. He sat up fast, gasping, his eyes wide and unfocused, and before the sound had fully left his throat, the man was beside him. Not across the room, not slow. There, like he'd never stopped paying attention. "Hey," his hand on the boy's back. I've got you, Eli." The boy grabbed his father's arm with both hands. The way he grabbed it, the particular grip, the specific desperation, told Rowan that this was not the first time Eli had woken up afraid, that this was a practiced exchange between two people who had been keeping each other together through something she didn't yet know the shape of. "The horses," the boy said. He was still half asleep. "Are the horses okay?" "The horses are fine. You said that last time and they weren't." The man was quiet for a beat. "This time they're fine. I promise." Eli lay back down. He was asleep again in under 2 minutes, the way children can be when they finally feel safe enough to let go. Silas stayed crouched beside him for a while longer. Then he stood, slowly, his body making the small adjustments of someone managing pain, and he turned and found Rowan watching him. He didn't apologize for being watched. She didn't apologize for watching. "Last time," she said, her voice low, "when the horses weren't fine. What happened?" He walked to the table and sat down. His hands wrapped around the mug she'd left him, long cold by now, and he stared into it. "Someone burned our barn," he said. She waited. "We weren't supposed to survive it," he said. "The plan, I mean, the way it was set up." He paused. "Eli got out because he was sleeping in the loft and the smoke woke him and he came to find me. If he'd slept deeper—" He stopped, set the mug down. "He's 8. He shouldn't have had to pull his father out of a burning building." Rowan was quiet for a moment. The storm groaned against the roof. "Who burned it?" she said. The gray eyes came up to hers. "People who want something I have," he said. "Or had. I'm not sure anymore what counts as mine." It was more than she'd expected him to give her. She could see the effort it cost him, the way his jaw tightened after the words came out, like a man who'd been quiet so long that speaking felt like bleeding. "You're not just passing through," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," he admitted. "No, I'm not." "Then what are you doing on my mountain?" He looked at her for a long time, long enough that the lamp flame shifted twice and the storm outside dropped briefly to a moan before building back up again. "Looking for somewhere to stop," he said. "Just for a minute, just to stop." It was so honest and so tired that Rowan didn't have an answer for it. She'd said something close to that herself, 2 winters ago, sitting in this same chair after they'd buried her husband in the ground, and the bank had sent its first letter and the mountain had shown her exactly how indifferent it was to her survival. She'd been looking for somewhere to stop too. She still was, some days. "You can stay until the storm breaks," she said finally. "After that, we'll see." He nodded, just that. No effusive gratitude, no promises, just a nod, the way one person acknowledges something real that another person has said. She respected that. By morning, the blizzard hadn't broken. It had doubled. Rowan was up before first light. She was always up before first light, because the animals didn't sleep in and neither could she, and she stepped over the man dozing in the chair without waking him and pulled on her coat and her boots and went out into the white. She was halfway to the barn when she realized someone was already there. She stopped. The barn door was open. Just barely, just a crack of light coming from inside, and she could hear beneath the wind the sound of something being moved. Wood. Heavy. Her hand went to the pistol at her hip. She pushed the door open. Silas Granger was inside, and he'd found her broken fence post, the one she'd propped against the south wall 6 weeks ago when the ground froze too hard to reset it. And he was studying it the way a man studies a problem he intends to solve. He hadn't heard her come in. He was just standing there in the gray light, turning the post in his hands, looking at the socket where the rotted base had given way. He looked up when the cold came in with her. "Your bay mare's favoring her right front," he said. "You want me to look at it?" Rowan stared at him. He was standing in her barn in the dark at 6 in the morning after arriving half dead in a blizzard 12 hours ago, talking about her horse's leg. "You know horses?" she said. He gave her a look that was almost, not quite, amused. "I know horses," he said. She crossed her arms. "What do you know about fence posts?" He held up the broken one. "More than whoever installed this one. This split because the base wasn't set deep enough. In this kind of freeze, you need—" "I know how deep to set a post," she said. "I set it in October when the ground was still soft, and then the frost moved it." He looked at it again. "I can reset it. When the storm breaks. You don't have to do that. I know I don't." He set the post down. "I'd like to." There was a beat between them. The wind pushed at the barn walls. One of the horses shifted in its stall. "The bay mare's name is Clara," Rowan said. "If you're going to look at her leg, she needs to know your name first. She's particular." He blinked. "She needs to know my name. She's smart, smarter than most people. Talk to her before you touch her." He stood there for a moment, and she caught the edge of it again. That quality she couldn't quite name, the thing that kept sitting wrong, the gap between how he moved and how he talked, and who he was claiming to be. A drifter doesn't study a fence post like an engineer. A man running doesn't wake up at dawn to fix a stranger's barn. She left him to it and went to start breakfast, and she told herself she was being practical, and she was almost convinced. Eli woke up better than she'd expected him to, color back in his face, alert in the quick, curious way of a child who observes everything and apologizes for nothing. He stood in her kitchen and looked at every single thing on every shelf with enormous dark eyes and didn't touch any of it without asking first, which told her more about who'd raised him than anything his father had said. "Are you Miss Rowan?" he said. "Just Rowan." He thought about this. "My papa said we can't stay long." "I heard that. But I think he was saying it because he thought you'd want to hear it." He tilted his head. "He does that sometimes. Says things people want to hear instead of what he actually means." Rowan set a plate in front of him and sat down. "And what does he actually mean?" she said. Eli poked at the eggs. "He's tired," he said simply. "He doesn't say it, but I can tell. He gets this look, like he's carrying something real heavy, and he forgot how to set it down." 8 years old and already reading his father like a map. "You're pretty sharp," Rowan said. Eli shrugged. He ate a forkful of egg. "Papa says I got my mama's eyes. He means more than just the looking part." Rowan didn't ask about the mother. Some questions announce themselves when the time is right. She'd learned to wait for that. Outside, the storm pushed and howled, and inside the cabin, something had shifted in the night without anyone deciding it should. The particular unplanned chemistry of 3 people who had each been carrying something heavy finding themselves, for a brief strange moment, in the same small warm room. She didn't know yet what it meant, but she felt it. She felt it the way you feel weather coming, the way the air changes before everything else does. The way a door, once opened, changes the shape of the room it's in, permanently, irrevocably, whether you meant it to or not. She had meant to let them in for one night. She already knew, sitting at her kitchen table watching this serious little boy eat scrambled eggs, that she'd been wrong about what one night meant. And somewhere in the barn, the man who called himself Silas Granger was talking quietly to her bay mare. She could hear it now, just barely, under the wind. And Clara, who trusted nobody, was letting him. The storm held for 3 more days. Rowan had lived through Montana winters long enough to know that the mountain didn't care about your plans or your guests, or the careful distance you tried to keep between yourself and the rest of the world. When the snow came down like that, thick and sideways and without any particular hurry, It closed every road, buried every fence line, and made the half-mile between the cabin and the barn feel like a different country. There was nothing to do but wait it out and try not to kill each other in the meantime. She'd expected it to be harder. Two strangers in a one-room cabin with a kitchen table between them and a child who asked questions about everything. The mounted rifle above the door, the jar of dried sage on the windowsill, the reason the south wall had a different kind of log than the other three. Eli asked about all of it. He asked about it the way very smart children ask about things, not to fill silence, but because he genuinely wanted to know, and had not yet learned that curiosity makes adults uncomfortable. Rowan answered him. All of it. She didn't talk down to him or shorten her sentences or use the soft, rounded voice some people use with children like they're nervous about frightening them. She just answered straight, and Eli listened straight, and by the second day they had developed a kind of shorthand. She'd start a sentence and he'd finish it, or he'd ask a question and she'd answer with another question, and he'd work it out himself and come back with the answer an hour later while she was doing something else entirely. The south wall, he announced on the second afternoon, appearing at her elbow while she was checking the stovepipe. Different logs because the original ones rotted. You replace them yourself. The notching is different from the other three walls. She looked at him. That's right, she said. He looked satisfied in a way that reminded her of someone. It took her a moment to place it. Then she realized it reminded her of herself, at that age, working something out from first principles and feeling the particular pleasure of being correct, not because someone told her, but because she'd figured it. She didn't say that, but she noticed it. Silas, for his part, stayed mostly out of the way, not in the passive, uninvested way of a man waiting to leave. More like a man who understood instinctively that he was in someone else's space and was calibrating his presence accordingly. He asked before he touched anything. He worked without being asked, quietly, efficiently, the kind of work that shows up in the results rather than announcing itself. On the second morning, she found that someone had stacked the woodpile under the covered section of the porch so it wouldn't ice over. On the third morning, the loose hinge on the barn's interior gate had been tightened with a pin she'd left sitting on a shelf for weeks because she hadn't gotten around to it. She didn't say anything about either of these things, neither did he, but she watched him. She couldn't help it. There was something about the way he moved through space, deliberately, always with his back toward the wall when he sat down, always positioned to see the door, that nagged at her the way a word you can't quite remember nags at you. He carried himself like a man who had trained himself to take up less room than he naturally would, like someone who had, at some point, learned that being noticed was a liability. On the third night, after Eli had fallen asleep with one of Rowan's old almanacs open across his chest, she sat across from Silas at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and put it on the table between them. "You're not a drifter," she said. He wrapped both hands around his cup. He didn't pretend not to understand. "No," he said. "The coat you came in with. The horses you had tethered at the tree line. Yes, I saw them. I went out to check them the first morning. Those aren't working horses. Those are breeding stock. One of those animals is worth more than my entire ranch." His jaw tightened. "And your hands," she said. "You know how to work. You're not afraid of it. But those aren't the hands of a man who's been working with them his whole life." He looked down at his hands on the cup. "You're observant," he said. "I'm alive," she said, "on a mountain, alone, for 2 winters. Being observant is the same thing as being alive." A long pause. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had finally dropped to something bearable. Not quiet, just less violent than it had been. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. The same words he'd said on the porch, but different now, in the way things are different when they're said by someone you've spent 3 days watching rather than a stranger standing in the dark. "I didn't think you were," Rowan said. "I'm not asking because I'm afraid of you. I'm asking because you're in my house, and my house is my business, and whatever's chasing you is going to show up on my mountain eventually if you stay long enough." She paused. "And you need to stay. Your horses need rest, your boy needs a week minimum before that chill is out of him, and your own head still isn't right and you know it." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know the head isn't right?" "You've been tilting to the left when you carry things. Very slightly. You're compensating for something." He looked at her steadily for a moment and then let out a breath through his nose that was almost a laugh, except not quite. "You're going to need to know eventually," he said. It didn't sound like surrender, more like a man who had run the numbers and arrived at an answer he didn't love but couldn't argue with. "Not everything, not yet, but enough." "Enough is fine," she said. "The barn fire I told you about. It wasn't an accident and it wasn't random." He turned the cup in his hands. "There are men looking for me, not lawmen, private men, working for money. They burned the barn to move me, to make me run scared in a direction someone else chose." "Did it work?" He met her eyes. "I'm on your mountain in a blizzard with a head wound and my 8-year-old. You tell me." "So someone maneuvered you here?" "Someone tried to maneuver me. There's a difference." His voice had an edge in it now. Quiet, but there. "I picked the North Pass. Nobody who knows this range well would expect that route in this weather. I made it harder to follow." "You also nearly killed yourself and your son." "Yes," he said flatly. "I know that." The acknowledgement had no defense in it, just the bare weight of a decision that had been right in calculation and wrong in every other way. And a man who was living with that fact without trying to talk himself out of it. Rowan had met men who couldn't do that, who would have immediately started explaining why it wasn't really that bad or why they hadn't had a choice. And the absence of that in Silas Granger said something she wasn't sure she was ready to think about yet. "What do they want?" she asked. "Something I have, or something they think I have." He glanced at Eli's sleeping face. "I'm not going to tell you the rest tonight." She nodded. She'd expected that. "One more thing," she said. "The name Granger." His eyes came up. "It's not the name you were born with," she said. It wasn't a question. He understood that and didn't insult her by treating it like one. "No," he said. "All right." She stood up, took her cup to the basin. "The storm should break by morning. You can start on that fence post when the ground's workable." She paused without turning around. "And the roof on the south side of the barn needs looking at before the next snow. If you're going to be here, you might as well be useful." She heard him exhale, heard the small, specific quality of it. Not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sound a man makes when he's been holding himself ready to be turned out into the cold, and instead finds himself, unexpectedly, allowed to stay. "I can do that," he said. "I know you can," she said. "That's why I'm asking. Let's say." The storm broke on the fourth morning the way Montana storms often break. Not gradually, but all at once, as though someone had simply decided enough and pulled the clouds back to reveal a sky so clear and blue it almost looked cold itself. The temperature dropped another 15 degrees, which around here meant that the freeze would do the work the wind hadn't, but at least you could see where you were going. Silas was in the barn before Rowan had finished her coffee. She watched him from the window, not because she was surveilling him, she was past that mostly, but because there was something in the way he worked that she couldn't stop watching. He'd found her post-hole tools and was studying the south fence line the way he'd studied the broken fence post 3 days ago, methodically, patiently, walking its full length in the snow before he touched anything. He was mapping it in his head before he picked up a single tool. Eli appeared at her elbow. "Papa always does that," the boy said, following her gaze. "Does what?" "Looks at the whole thing before he starts. He says you can't fix part of something without understanding all of it." Eli's breath made a small cloud on the window glass. "He used to say that about—" He stopped. "About what?" Eli glanced at her sideways. "Other things. Before." Before. The word sat there with all its weight. Rowan didn't press. "You want to go help him?" she said. Eli's face transformed. "Can I?" "Bundle up, all the way, scarf around the neck, not just over it." He was out the door in under 2 minutes, running toward his father in the snow, and Rowan watched Silas look up from the fence line and catch the boy without breaking stride. Just opened one arm and absorbed the impact and kept walking. Eli tucked against his side and started showing him something about the fence post, the way you explain things to someone you expect to understand. Something about it made her chest ache in a way she didn't particularly want to examine. She turned back to her coffee. "What?" He reset 4 fence posts that day. She would have said 2 was a reasonable expectation given the frozen ground, but by late afternoon she counted 4, and they were set better than she'd managed herself in October, deep and packed with gravel below the frost line, and she knew without being told that he'd done it right the first time. "Where did you learn to set fence?" she asked him that evening. He handed her a plate. He'd made dinner, which she'd expected to object to, and then found she couldn't when she saw he'd done it without asking and hadn't made a production of it. Just cooked. Simple. Not fancy. "My grandfather's property," he said. "In the summers, he had about 1,200 acres in the eastern range. He believed that a man who couldn't maintain his own fence line couldn't maintain much of anything else." Smart man. He had his moments. Had. He died 6 years ago. No elaboration. He sat down across from Eli, who was drawing something on a piece of paper she'd given him. He was the last one in the family who thought about things that way. What way? He looked at his plate. Earning what you have, instead of just taking it. She let that sit. It had the weight of something specific, an opinion formed against a particular example rather than a general philosophy, and she was learning to hear the difference. Eli looked up from his drawing. "Papa, can I show Rowan the horses tomorrow?" "If she wants to see them." Eli turned to Rowan with the full force, unguarded hope of a child. "Do you want to?" he said. She looked at him. "Show me what you're drawing first." He held it up. It was a horse, actually a remarkably accurate horse for an 8-year-old, the proportions decent, the legs right, and beside it a small figure that was obviously Eli, and another figure beside that which was taller and clearly meant to be his father, and at the end of the paper a third figure, smaller than Silas, standing at the cabin door. She recognized it as herself before she'd consciously decided to. "Who's that?" she said, pointing to the figure at the door. Plain dumb. Eli gave her the look children give adults who are being deliberately slow. "You," he said. "You're watching us." "Am I?" "You watch everything," he said, not unkindly. "It's okay. Papa does it too." Rowan looked at Silas. He was looking at his plate, but there was color at the side of his jaw that hadn't been there before. "It's a good drawing," Rowan said. Eli beamed and went back to it, adding details to the horse's mane with focused intensity. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The horses rested, grew steady, filled out on the good hay Rowan bought from the Aldrin place 6 miles down the valley. Eli's color came back fully. He started waking up in the mornings without that reflexive grab for his father's arm, without the checking, the verifying, which told her the nightmares were spacing out, the particular terror of the barn fire losing some of its grip. Silas worked. He worked with the kind of consistent, methodical energy that is actually harder to maintain than bursts of effort, and the ranch began to show it. The south barn roof was repaired. The gate hinge that had been half dead since October was replaced with a new mechanism she hadn't known where to source, and he'd apparently fashioned himself from materials she hadn't realized she had. The stock tank's heating element, which had been unreliable all winter, was rewired so cleanly that it worked better than when she'd bought it. She paid him. She had to argue with him about it, which she hadn't expected. "I'm not taking your money," he said, the second week. "You gave us shelter." "I gave you a cot and eggs," she said. "You've put in $300 of labor on this property. I'm not running a charity, and neither are you." She held out the folded bills. "Take it." He took it. He didn't look happy about it. She noticed he immediately put it in Eli's coat pocket, which she pretended not to see. There were things she noticed and pretended not to see. It was becoming a habit. She noticed that he read, every book on her shelf, working through them systematically, not randomly, and that his reading was the reading of someone with a real education who paused to think rather than just to turn pages. She noticed that when the Aldrin boy came by with a delivery and mentioned something about the railroad company buying up grazing rights in the Southern Valley, Silas went very still in a specific way. Not the stillness of disinterest, but the stillness of a person who has heard something that matters enormously to them and is working very hard not to show it. She noticed that he sometimes stood at the window after Eli was asleep and looked south down the valley for long stretches of time, and that his face in those moments had none of the careful quietness he maintained during the day. She didn't ask about any of it. Not yet. She was learning him the way you learn difficult country, a little at a time, by watching how it behaves in different weather. God. The crack in the careful equilibrium came on a Tuesday afternoon, which is the kind of unremarkable day that tends to host remarkable events. Rowan had ridden down to the south field to check on the fence work and was coming back up the ridge when she heard horses on the main trail. Not one horse. 3. Moving at a deliberate pace that was not the pace of neighbors or suppliers. It was the pace of men who were looking for something and wanted to make sure you saw them coming. She turned Clara off the trail into the tree line and held her still. 3 riders. Well-dressed for outdoor work in the calculated way of men who want to appear at home somewhere they aren't. The lead rider was heavy through the shoulders, with the kind of face that gets to a certain age and simply decides to stop pretending at friendliness. He wore an expensive coat and cheap eyes, and he was looking at Rowan's fence line with the look of a man taking inventory of something he intends to own. She let them pass, then she doubled back to the cabin. Silas was in the barn. She went to him. 3 riders on the south trail, she said, coming toward the property. He was already moving. He put himself against the barn wall beside the door. Not behind it, beside it, where he could see without being seen, and she realized he'd done this calculation before the words were fully out of her mouth. The lead rider, she said. Heavy, dark coat, the kind of man who looks at your fence like it's already his. Something happened in Silas's face. It was brief, and it was controlled, but it was not nothing. Victor Kane, he said. The name landed in the space between them with a weight she hadn't expected. You know him, she said. He knows me. He moved to look through the gap in the barn door, or he's looking for me. Those are different things, and right now I need to know which one it is. He was looking at my fence, Rowan said. My property, not searching for someone. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he turned from the door and his face was set in that particular way. The way she'd started to recognize. The way that meant he'd made a decision and was now operating from it rather than deliberating. He's not just looking for me, Silas said. He's here for your land. Rowan stared. My land. The railroad route. The one they're planning south through the valley. His voice was even, but she could hear something underneath it. The specific controlled anger of a man who has seen this play before. They need this ridge. Whoever owns this property controls the grade access to the southern pass. Without it, the route has to go 15 miles around, which adds costs they don't want to absorb. He paused. Victor Kane has been buying out every rancher in this valley for the past 18 months. The ones who wouldn't sell. He stopped. Rowan thought of 2 families she hadn't seen at the supply exchange in months. The Yarnell place, empty since November. The Crew brothers, who'd sold fast and moved out fast and never come back. What happened to the ones who wouldn't sell? She asked. Silas met her eyes. Things caught fire, he said. Or the bank called in debts that had been manageable until they weren't. Or a man found himself accused of something he didn't do and couldn't afford to fight it in court. A pause. Victor Kane doesn't use force when pressure works. He's a patient man. How do you know all this? The question sat there. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him deciding something. She could see the exact moment the decision was made. And then he said, because I've seen his work before, up close. It was still not the whole truth, she could tell, but it was a real piece of it, and the piece had enough edges on it to cut. Is he the one who burned your barn? She said. Someone working for him, he said. Or for the people he's working for. There's a layer above Victor Kane, and I can't prove it yet. Yet, she said. Yet, he said. The riders were visible now through the barn door gap. They'd reached the main gate, and one of them was getting down to look at the lock. Rowan straightened. I need to go talk to them, she said. Rowan, this is my property, she said. Flat and final. And I am the person who lives on it. You stay in here. Don't come out until they're gone. He looked like he wanted to argue. She could see it, the impulse, the way his body tensed. And then she saw him stand it down, the way a man stands down something he knows is right, even when it costs him something. Be careful what you agree to, he said. Whatever he offers you, whatever number he names, don't say yes, don't say no. Tell him you'll think about it. I know how to handle men like that. Men like Victor Kane aren't like other men like that, Silas said. He'll read your face and build his approach from it. Don't let him read you. She thought about telling him she didn't need that advice. She thought about it, and then she thought about the Yarnell place, empty and dark all winter, and she held her tongue. Keep Eli inside, she said. He's asleep in the loft. She nodded and walked out of the barn toward her front gate, and she made sure her shoulders were level and her stride was even because Silas was right about one thing. Victor Kane, whoever he was going to read her the moment he saw her, and the first thing he read needed to be a woman who was not afraid. He was already off his horse by the time she reached the gate. Closer up, he was older than she'd thought on the trail, mid-50s, with silver at the temples, and the particular grooming of a man who has money and wants you to know it without him having to say so. He had a smile that arrived faster than it should, the kind of smile that is deployed rather than felt. Mrs. Ashford, he said. I believe that's right. It's Mrs. Miss, she said. And you are? Victor Kane. He said it the way men say their own names when they expect you to have heard it already. I represent a consortium of investors with an interest in the development of this valley. I wonder if I might have a moment of your time. You're on my property, she said. You're already having it. Something shifted in his smile. Not gone. Men like this don't lose the smile. They just adjust its angle. Efficient, he said. I appreciate that. He turned and looked at the ranch, the cabin, the barn, the fence line, the outbuildings, with the same inventory look she'd seen on the trail. This is a lovely piece of land. You've done well with it. What do you want, Mr. Kane? He looked back at her. His eyes, up close, were not the eyes of a patient man. They were quick eyes, calculating eyes. She thought of Silas's word, patient, and understood it differently now. Victor Kane was not patient by nature. He was patient by discipline. There's a difference, and it matters, because disciplined patience has a limit in a way that natural patience doesn't. I want to make you an offer for this property, he said. A very generous offer. More than market value. Significantly more. I'm not selling, she said. You haven't heard the number. It doesn't matter. I live here. She held his eyes. And I'll think about what you've said. It wasn't yes. It wasn't no. She watched him trying to read her face and finding less than he'd hoped for, and she felt, in that moment, the specific cold clarity of understanding that this was not going to be the last time they spoke. Of course, he said. Take your time. He reached into his coat and produced a card. She took it because not taking it would tell him something. The offer does have a timeline, naturally. These things always do. Most things do, she said. He held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then he nodded. A small, precise nod, the gesture of a man entering something into a ledger, and turned back to his horse. She watched them ride back down the south trail. She held the card in her hand until they were out of sight. Then she looked at it. A name, an address in the capital, a number for a telegraph office. She walked back to the barn. Silas was exactly where she'd left him, still against the wall, still watching the door gap. He'd heard every word. She could see it in his face before she said anything. He's going to come back, she said. Yes, Silas said, and the offer's going to get less generous each time. Yes. He looked at the card in her hand. And when it stops being an offer, it becomes something else. She put the card in her coat pocket. Her hand, she noticed, was perfectly steady. She was a little surprised by that, and then she wasn't. Eli still asleep, she said. Should be. Good. She turned toward the cabin. We need to talk. All 3 fence posts on the east line need checking anyway. I want to do that tomorrow, and I want you with me, not because I need the help, but because I need to show you the whole property. If someone's going to help me figure out what I'm dealing with, they need to know what they're looking at. She heard him fall into step behind her. Rowan, he said. She didn't stop walking. What? Thank you, he said, for not letting him see you flinch. She thought about the Yarnell place, the Crew brothers, 2 families who hadn't been able to hold on. I didn't flinch, she said, because I wasn't going to. She didn't add the rest of it. that she wasn't going to, but she also hadn't known before today what she was actually standing against. That Victor Kane and the people above him had been dismantling this valley, piece by piece, family by family, with the unhurried efficiency of men who were certain they would win. She knew it now, and she knew that the stranger she'd let in from the cold knew a great deal more about this than he'd told her yet, and that the telling was coming, and that whatever he was carrying, whatever the real name under the borrowed one, whatever the connection to a man who burned barns and bought up land and smiled with the precision of someone who had practiced it, it was going to change the shape of everything that came next. She walked into her cabin and put more wood in the stove because the temperature was dropping again, and she thought about what it meant to hold ground against a man like Victor Kane, and she understood for the first time that she wasn't going to be able to do it alone. The man who'd arrived with nothing, who'd set her fence posts deeper than she had, and talked her suspicious mare into trust, and watched the South Trail like someone waiting for an enemy he already knew. He was not what he'd said he was. She'd known that from the first night. Now it was starting to matter. They walked the east fence line the next morning without talking much, which suited them both. The cold had settled in the particular way it does after a blizzard breaks. Not the violent cold of the storm itself, but the still, heavy cold that follows, the kind that sits in the air like something waiting. Their breath came out in short, white clouds, and the snow squeaked under their boots, and Rowan pointed out the fence posts one by one, telling him which were sound and which needed work, and Silas listened without interrupting, which she was coming to understand was one of his consistent qualities. Eli had wanted to come. She'd led him as far as the first gate, and then sent him back with the task of checking the water troughs, which he'd accepted with the particular dignity of a child who understood he was being given real work rather than invented work. He took it seriously. That was the thing about Eli. He took everything seriously, which should have made him exhausting, and somehow didn't. "The third post from the corner," Rowan said, stopping in front of it. "That one's been leaning since September. I've been meaning to reset it." Silas crouched down, pressed his hand against the base, tested the give. "Day's work," he said. "Maybe less." "I know." He stood up. He brushed the snow off his glove, and he looked south, down the valley, the same direction he'd been looking from the window at night. From the fence line you could see farther. The whole lower range, the tree lines, the distant dark suggestion of other properties. "How much do you know about the railroad route?" he said. "What the Aldrin boy told me, that they're planning to run it south through the valley." "I don't know the specifics. The route they filed with the Territorial Commission goes through the eastern side of this valley," he said. "Your ridge is the highest point of the natural grade on that side. Without it, they'd have to tunnel or reroute. Both options cost more money than the consortium wants to spend." He paused. "Victor Kane has been acquiring land for 18 months. He has 12 properties in this valley already. Yours is one of 4 he still needs." "Who are the other 3? "The Aldrin place, the 2 parcels on the South Flat that the Crew brothers used to own. Kane already has those. He just doesn't have clear title yet because of a dispute over the original deed. And yours." He turned from the south view and looked at her. "Yours is the one that matters most. The grade access through your north ridge cuts the tunnel requirement entirely. Without this land, the eastern route is not financially viable." "How do you know all this?" she said. She kept her voice even. "The route filings, the consortium, the acquisition list, that's not the kind of information a man picks up passing through." He held her gaze. She could see him deciding again. The same thing she'd seen in the barn yesterday, the same internal accounting. "Come back to the cabin with me," he said. "I'll show you." She looked at him for a moment. The fence post behind him was still leaning. The South Valley was still spread out under that cold, pale sky. Something that had been building since the first night, since the moment she'd opened the door and seen his face in the snow, was about to arrive, and she could feel the weight of it the way you feel weather. "All right," she said. He kept his saddlebag in the barn. Not in the cabin, not in the loft. In the barn, tucked into the hay at the back of the second stall, which told her he'd made a calculation about where something needed to be that could be accessed quickly and abandoned fast if it came to that. He pulled it out and carried it to the kitchen table, and he set it down and looked at it for a moment with the look of a man who is about to do something irreversible and is making one final peace with that fact. Eli was still outside. They could hear him through the wall talking to Clara. He'd developed a habit of narrating things to the mayor, his day, his observations, the particular injustice of being told to go check water troughs when the fence line was clearly more interesting. Clara seemed to find it acceptable. Silas opened the saddlebag. He took out a leather portfolio, the kind that fastens with a brass clasp. He unfastened it and laid it open on the table, and Rowan looked at what was inside. Documents, a lot of them, some handwritten, some printed. Maps with lines and numbers on them. Letters. She could see the letterheads without reading them. Formal, institutional. And at the back, a photograph. The formal kind done in a studio, showing a man she half recognized and half didn't, in the way you half recognize someone out of context. She picked up the photograph. The man in it was younger, maybe 5-6 years younger. He was wearing a suit that had been fitted by someone who knew what they were doing, and he was standing in the studied way of formal portraits, not quite smiling, with the look of someone who would rather be somewhere else. Beside him was a woman, dark-haired, with a child on her lap, a toddler, maybe 2 years old, with dark eyes that Rowan knew very well by now. She set the photograph down. "Silas Blackwood," she said. He was watching her. "Blackwood Railroad," she said. The name came to her from somewhere. She'd heard it, read it somewhere, the kind of name that appears in territorial newspapers alongside words like expansion and acquisition and board of directors. "That's your family's company." "Was," he said. "My father's company. He built it from 2 engines and a promissory note on borrowed land. By the time he died, it was one of the largest private railroad operations in the Northern Territories." A pause. "He left it to both of his sons. Equal shares. Divided management. I handled operations and planning. My brother Donovan handled finance and investor relations." "Had," she said again, pulling the word from what he'd said earlier about his grandfather. "You use that word." "Because it's accurate." He pulled out one of the handwritten documents and turned it so she could read it. 8 months after my father died, Donovan began moving money. Not a lot at first, small transfers, the kind that look like operational expenses. But the pattern was there if you looked for it, and I looked for it because the operations numbers weren't matching the finance reports, and I couldn't account for the difference. Rowan looked at the document. Columns of numbers, dates, account notations. She wasn't an accountant, but she could read a ledger well enough to see the pattern he meant. Small amounts in regular intervals, all routing through a secondary account that wasn't in the company's standard books. "He was skimming," she said, at first. Then it became something larger. Silas pulled out another document, a letter. She could see the formal header. "Donovan had been in contact with Victor Kane's consortium for 14 months before I found out. The arrangement was this. Donovan would provide the consortium with inside information on the railroad's planned routes before they were filed publicly. The consortium would buy land along those routes at current prices, which are low, because the landowners don't know yet that a railroad is coming. When the route is announced, the land value increases dramatically. The consortium sells or leverages at the new price. Donovan takes a percentage." She sat down. Not because she was weak, because she needed to think, and standing up was getting in the way of it. "That's why the route matters," she said. "That's why Kane has been buying up this valley. He knows exactly where the railroad is going because your brother told him." "Yes." "And the landowners here, the Yarnells, the Crews, everyone Kane's been pressuring. They're being pushed off land they don't know is worth 10 times what he's offering them." "Yes," he said. "And the ones who won't sell, like you, he applies other pressure, debts called in, accidents, fires." He stopped. "Let that land." "My barn wasn't just about moving me. Donovan needed me out of the picture entirely. I'd been documenting the fraud for 4 months. I had enough to take to the railroad board, to the territorial commissioner, maybe to the federal level. Donovan knew I had it, and he couldn't let me use it." The weight of it was settling over her in layers. She kept her face still. "Your brother tried to kill you," she said. He didn't look away. "He tried to make it look like an accident. There's a version of events where a fire breaks out in a barn on a winter night, and a man and his child don't get out. And it's very sad. And there are no charges, and Donovan inherits full control of the company. His voice was perfectly level. The control it took to keep it that way was the loudest thing in the room. Eli woke up. I've thought about that night every day since, and I can't tell you why Eli woke up when he did. He just did. Rowan looked at Eli's drawing, still on the table from last night. The horse, the 3 figures, the cabin door. And you've been running since then, she said. Moving, not running. He pulled the portfolio back toward him, carefully, the way you handle something that can't be replaced. I still have all of it. Everything I documented. The account transfers, the letters between Donovan and Kane, the falsified route filings, the land acquisition records that prove Kane had advanced knowledge. It's enough. It was enough 4 months ago. He paused. What I didn't have was a safe position to use it from. A man can have all the evidence in the world, and if he's isolated and discredited and running, it doesn't matter. The story becomes, disgruntled brother makes accusations, unstable since his wife died. The evidence gets questioned, delayed, buried. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Your wife, she said. He looked at the photograph on the table, just for a second. She died 2 years ago. Fever. It had nothing to do with any of this. She just got sick and she died, and I handled it badly. He said it in the flat, undressed way of someone who has said it to himself 1,000 times and has stopped trying to make it sound like anything other than what it was. Donovan used it. After she died, I wasn't functioning the way I should have been for a while, and Donovan used that time to move faster. By the time I was paying attention again, he'd been at it for over a year. And Eli, she said. Eli is the reason I paid attention again. He looked at her, and it was the most direct he'd looked at her since the night on the porch. He's 8 years old. He pulled me out of a burning building. I'm not going to let the people who did that to him keep what they took. The fire in it was quiet, but it was absolute. The kind of thing that doesn't need to raise its voice because it doesn't have any doubts. Rowan sat with all of it for a moment. Outside, she could hear Eli still talking to Clara, some elaborate narration about the relative merits of different types of hay. Victor Kane came here looking for your land, she said finally. Not for you. Not yet. He may not know I'm here. But your brother does, or suspects. Donovan knows I'm in the territory. He doesn't know where. How long before he finds out? Silas was quiet. Kane has men asking questions in the valley towns. It's only a matter of time before someone mentions a stranger and his boy at the Ashford Ranch. She nodded slowly. She was working through it, the shape of it, the way she worked through any practical problem. What are the assets? What are the liabilities? What are the constraints? What needs to happen in what order? You need to use the evidence, she said, from a position that can't be discredited. Yes, which means you can't keep hiding. No. You have to come back, she said, as yourself, publicly. He looked at the table. Something moved through his face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite resignation. It was the look of a man who has known for a while what the answer is and has been refusing to look directly at it. If I do that, he started. If you do that, you're a target, she said, a visible one. Yes. But if you don't, Kane keeps buying out this valley, and your brother keeps the company, and the evidence you've been carrying through a Montana winter becomes a story about a disturbed man who ran away. Yes, he said. Quiet. I know. So the question isn't whether, she said. It's how. He looked at her. The gray eyes held something she hadn't seen in them before. Not quite surprise, but its neighbor. The look of a man who had been carrying something alone for so long that having someone else pick up the other end of it was briefly disorienting. I've been working on how, he said. I have contacts on the railroad board. 2 members who are loyal to my father and who I believe are not part of Donovan's arrangement. If I can get the documentation to them before Donovan and Kane realize what's happening, there's a chance the board acts before anyone can suppress it. A chance. A real one. She turned the photograph face down on the table, not because she was bothered by it, because she was done looking at the past version of this man and needed to think about the present one. There's a telegraph office in Harlan, she said. 12 miles south. If Kane's men are watching the valley towns, they may be watching Harlan. Probably. The Aldrin family has a rider they use for long-distance messages, not through the telegraph. He carries letters. He goes to the capital twice a month. She paused. He's due in 4 days. Silas stared at her. You'd use your contact for this. I'd use my contact to get a letter to 2 railroad board members before Victor Kane's men know it's been sent, she said. Yes, if the documentation is what you say it is. It is. Then you have 4 days to put together what needs to go in that letter. She stood up, pushed her chair back. And in 4 days, we'll see what kind of men your father's board members are. She moved toward the door to call Eli in for lunch, and she stopped with her hand on the frame. She didn't turn around. Silas Blackwood, she said, trying the name. It fit him differently than Granger had. Sat on him more honestly, like a coat that had actually been made for the person wearing it. Yes, he said. The woman in the photograph. What was her name? A pause. Margaret. Maggie. Eli has her eyes, Rowan said. Like you told him. He does. She raised him right. The first 2 years of it, anyway. She opened the door. The rest of it. The part where he woke up and pulled his father out? That's him. That's who he is. She called Eli's name before Silas could respond, and the boy came running from the barn with snow on his boots and something he'd found in the hay that he was very excited about showing her. And the afternoon moved forward the way afternoons do, relentless, indifferent to the weight of what had just been said inside. The 4 days were not quiet. On the second day, one of Kane's riders came back to the property. Not Kane himself this time. A younger man, less polished, with the look of someone sent to gather information rather than conduct negotiations. He asked about the road condition to the North Pass. He asked whether Rowan had seen any unfamiliar horses in the area. He asked his questions with the casual arrangement of someone who wants them to seem unrelated to each other. Rowan answered all of them, truthfully, mostly. The road was bad. She'd seen no unfamiliar horses. The casual mostly was this. Silas's horses were currently in her barn, and Silas himself was currently in her hayloft 200 feet away, and Eli was in the cabin with instructions to stay there and stay quiet, and none of that was in her face when she spoke to the rider because she had decided it wouldn't be, and she was a woman who kept her decisions. The rider left. She went straight to the barn. He was looking for you, she said. Silas came down from the loft. There was hay in his hair. She didn't mention it. I heard, he said. He wasn't subtle enough for Kane to have trained him. He's local muscle, hired recent. Which means Kane is accelerating. He's not waiting on the offer to work. Silas moved to the barn door and looked at the trail where the rider had gone. He's building a case for something, probably constructing reasons to challenge your deed or your debt status. My debt status, she said. The words had a particular edge. I owe the Territorial Bank $1,400 on a loan my husband took out before he died. I've been making payments. I'm current. Are you? As of November, which is the last time I checked. He looked at her. She saw the thing she didn't want to see in his face. Kane's people have been approaching banks in 3 other Valley cases, he said. They don't need to manufacture a default. They just need to buy the debt and call it early. It's legal. It's clean. It takes about 6 weeks from purchase to notice. She did the math in her head. The November payment. 6 weeks from then. It's February, she said. Yes, he said. She breathed in through her nose, breathed out. Her hands, at her sides, were very still, the way her hands got when she was making sure they didn't do something reflexive. How certain are you? Not certain, he said. But if I were Kane and I had a target who refused an offer, a debt is the cleanest tool. No confrontation, no witnesses, just a notice of accelerated repayment and a timeline that's impossible to meet. $1,400, she said. I don't have $1,400. No, he said. I know. She looked at him. Is that an offer? It's an observation, he said. Then, and yes. She felt the complicated thing that moved through her at that. The particular pride of a person who has managed on their own for 2 hard winters, being offered help by a man she'd known for 4 weeks. And underneath that pride, The equally particular pragmatism of a person who understands that pride costs money she doesn't have. "I don't take charity," she said. "I know you don't. This isn't charity. It's—" He stopped. Tried again. "The reason Kane wants your land is because of the railroad route. The reason the railroad route matters is because of what my brother did. You are in this position because of my family's corruption. The least complicated way I can think of to describe what I'm offering is that it's a debt owed." She looked at him for a long moment. "We'll talk about it after the letter goes," she said. "Fair enough." The letter went on the fourth day. Tom Aldrin was 17 and had been doing his father's long-distance riding for 3 years. And he had the particular quality of a young man who understood that the less he knew about what he was carrying, the better he slept. And he had passed this understanding on to himself without anyone having to explain it. He took the sealed portfolio with 2 letters inside, one for a man named Hargrove on the railroad board, one for a woman named Celia Park, who was a territorial land attorney in the capital, and he tucked it inside his coat and rode south without asking any questions. Rowan watched him go from the porch. Behind her, Silas came out of the cabin. He stood beside her, not close, just at the edge of the porch, and watched the rider disappear into the tree line at the bottom of the valley. "Now we wait," he said. "I've done harder things than wait," she said. "I know you have." The afternoon light was doing something specific to the snow on the south ridge, that particular late winter light that makes everything look briefly, falsely warm, like a painting of winter rather than the real thing. She'd always found it beautiful and slightly deceptive at the same time. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When you came to my door," she said, "that first night, I almost didn't open it." "I know," he said. "Not because I was afraid of you. I mean, I was, but that wasn't the main reason." He was quiet. "I'd been thinking about leaving," she said, "before you came. Not to Kane. I wasn't going to sell to him. I didn't know about him yet. But I'd been thinking about whether this—" She made a small gesture that took in the cabin, the barn, the ridge, all of it. "Whether this was still what I was holding on to, or whether I was just afraid to admit I was already done with it." He said nothing. She was glad he didn't. "I hadn't told anyone that," she said. "I barely told myself." "What changed your mind?" he said. "About staying." She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about hard things. "The morning after you came," she said, "I went out to check the animals, and you'd already stacked the wood under the cover. You didn't tell me. You didn't do it so I'd see you doing it. You just did it." She paused. "I don't know. Something about that." She shook her head slightly, recognizing how thin it sounded laid out in words. "It wasn't about you. It was about being reminded that the work mattered, that there was point in it." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "The first morning I woke up here," he said, "after the storm, I looked at this property and I thought, this is what it's supposed to look like, before something goes wrong with it." He paused. "My father had property like this, before the company got big enough to become its own thing, when it was just land and animals and the work of maintaining it." Another pause. "I missed it. I didn't know I missed it until I was standing in your barn at 6 in the morning looking at a broken fence post." She turned her head and looked at him. He was looking at the south ridge. "Silas Blackwood," she said. "That's going to take some getting used to," he said. "Hearing it." "You'd better get used to it," she said. "You're going to be saying it in public very soon." "I know. Are you afraid?" He considered it, actually considered it, rather than answering fast. "Yes," he said. "Not of Kane. Of being, He stopped. "Of being who I used to be again. In public. Where everyone can see whether it still fits." It was possibly the most honest thing he'd said to her. She looked back at the valley. "It'll fit differently," she said. "That's not the same as not fitting." He didn't answer. But she heard the quality of his silence shift, the way the air shifts when a tension releases somewhere you couldn't quite locate. On the 6th day after the letter went, Victor Kane came back. Not with 2 men this time, with 5. And he came at noon, which is the time you come when you want to be seen, when you want the message to be that you're not doing anything furtive, that you're simply a man with a legal matter to discuss in the plain light of day. He had a document with him. Rowan saw him coming from the kitchen window, and she put down her coffee, and she said, without turning her head, "He's here." Silas was at the table with Eli, working through what appeared to be an arithmetic lesson. Eli had complained that the almanac didn't have enough numbers in it, and Silas had been solving this by inventing progressively complicated word problems, which Eli was solving with an intensity that suggested he'd forgotten they were educational. He looked up. "How many men?" "5. He stood. He put his hand briefly on the back of Eli's head. Just a touch, quick, not gentle exactly, but real. And Eli looked up at him with the particular understanding of a child who has learned to read the room. "Stay inside," Silas said, "no matter what." Eli nodded. He didn't argue, which told her he understood the weight of it. Rowan was already at the door. They walked out together. She hadn't planned that, hadn't decided it. It just happened, the two of them stepping off the porch at the same time, shoulder to shoulder, which she understood immediately was a choice that could not be taken back. Kane saw them. She watched the calculation happen in his face, the shift, the rapid reassessment, the adjustment of the smile. He stopped his horse at the gate. "Miss Ashford," he said, and then with a pause that was precisely the right length to convey that he was choosing whether to acknowledge the man beside her. "I don't believe we've met." Silas said nothing. He stood at her left shoulder, and he looked at Victor Kane with the gray eyes that didn't give anything away. And he waited. Kane reached into his coat and produced the document. He held it out, not toward Rowan, she noticed, but between them, deliberately ambiguous. "I've taken the liberty of reviewing the financial records associated with this property," he said. "I'm afraid the Territorial Bank has assigned Miss Ashford's loan to a new servicer. The new servicer has reviewed the terms and determined that the loan qualifies for early acceleration. The total balance is due within 30 days. Rowan felt the cold of it. Not fear, not exactly, but the specific physical impact of hearing confirmed what you'd suspected and hoped was wrong. $1,400. 30 days. She was about to speak when Silas said, "What's the name of the new servicer?" His voice was different. Not different from how he talked to her, different in a larger way. Something had gone out of it, or rather, something had come into it, something she hadn't heard before. The voice of a man who had run a company, who had sat across from men like Victor Kane in actual boardrooms and understood exactly what they were doing and was no longer pretending otherwise. Kane's smile adjusted again. The eyes got sharper. "Consolidated Valley Holdings," Kane said. "Filed with the Territorial Banking Commission when?" Silas said. "I don't see how that's—" 3 weeks ago, Silas said, or 4, before your rider came here the first time. You were already buying the debt when you made the first offer, which means the offer was never the primary play. It was theater, to establish a paper record of good faith negotiation. He paused. "You know who I am." Kane looked at him for a long moment. The smile was gone now. Underneath it was the face of a man doing arithmetic. "I know who you were," Kane said. "Silas Blackwood. Deceased, officially, as of 3 months ago. A man who died in a barn fire along with his son." He tilted his head. "Interesting situation." "Isn't it?" Silas said. "Your brother will be very relieved to hear you're alive," Kane said, and every word of it was a threat in the shape of concern. Silas was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "I imagine he will." "I'd encourage you," Kane said, and now the voice had changed too, dropped the veneer of the negotiator and become something more direct and less pleasant, "to think very carefully about the position you're in. A man who's officially dead has no legal standing, no right to property, no right to the courts, no right to present evidence of anything. You are, legally speaking, a ghost." "That's an interesting legal theory," Silas said. "I'll be curious to see how it holds up when the railroad board receives the documentation I sent them 6 days ago." The silence that followed was very complete. Kane's horse shifted under him. He controlled it without looking down, the automatic reflex of a man managing something else. 6 days ago, he said. His voice was flat now. All the careful texture had gone out of it. "Letters travel fast when the rider knows what he's carrying matters," Silas said. I'd expect responses by end of week. It was a bluff about the timeline, partly. They had no way to know when the board members would respond. But the documentation itself was real, and Kane was doing the calculation behind his eyes, trying to determine whether this was a bluff or a disaster. And the fact that he couldn't immediately rule out disaster was the most information Silas had available to use. Kane looked at Rowan. His eyes went from her to Silas and back, and she could see the reassessment happening the moment when the man he'd planned to deal with became a more complicated problem. "This isn't finished," Kane said. "No," Silas agreed. "It isn't." Kane turned his horse. The 5 men with him turned without a word, the choreography of men who do this for a living, and they rode back down the south trail at the same deliberate pace they'd arrived at. Rowan stood on her porch and watched them go, and she was aware of several things simultaneously. That her hands were not shaking, which surprised her. That Silas beside her was breathing harder than he'd been before, which he was managing to keep mostly invisible. And that Eli was watching from the window, his small face pressed against the glass, taking in every detail of what had just happened with those enormous dark eyes. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, 6 days ago. The letters have been traveling 6 days. Yes, he said. So we don't actually know yet if anyone's read them. No. She looked south. The riders were already small on the trail. He's going to tell your brother, she said, within the hour, if he can get to a telegraph. Which means Donovan knows where you are by tonight. Yes. She turned and looked at him. He was still watching the south trail, and his face had the look of a man who has just stepped off a ledge and has not yet determined whether there's ground below him. You spoke as yourself, she said. He looked at her. Out there just now, she said. You spoke as Silas Blackwood, not Granger, not a hired man. She paused. You can't take that back. I know, he said. Is that what you wanted? He was quiet for a moment. Somewhere above them, a hawk cut across the cold sky, hunting. I wanted my son back in his own name, he said. I wanted the people who burned our barn to face what they did. I wanted the ranchers in this valley to keep what's theirs. He paused. Whether I wanted it for myself, he stopped. I don't know. I haven't let myself want things for myself in a while. She looked at him. Start, she said. She went inside. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And the afternoon was already moving, and the temperature was dropping, and she needed to check the animals and think about what came next. And she was not a woman who stood still on porches when there was any of those things to do. But she had meant what she said, and she thought he knew it. The response from Hargrove came on a Thursday. Tom Aldrin brought it himself, riding harder than his usual pace, and Rowan knew from the way he came up the trail, fast, no stopping at the gate, straight to the porch, that whatever he was carrying mattered. She was splitting wood when she heard the hoofbeats, and she had the axe down and was walking toward him before he'd fully stopped. He handed her a sealed envelope without getting off his horse. His face had the expression of a young man who understood he'd been part of something larger than a letter delivery and wasn't sure yet how he felt about it. There's another one, he said, and pulled a second envelope from his coat. From a woman named Park. She sent a separate rider. Met me on the South Road this morning. Rowan took both. You weren't followed? He gave her a look that said he was slightly offended by the question. No, ma'am. Good. Go get something from the kitchen. Eli will feed you. She was already walking toward the barn before he dismounted. Silas was repairing the gate mechanism when she came in. He'd had it half dismantled for 2 days, waiting on a part he'd fashioned from scrap iron. And she'd left him to it because the focused mechanical quality of the work seemed to be doing something for him in the days since Kane's visit, keeping his hands on a problem he could solve while waiting on the ones he couldn't. She held up both envelopes. He set down the tool in his hand. He didn't move fast. She'd noticed that about him, that his reactions in important moments tended to slow down rather than speed up, as though his body understood that the stakes required more care, not less. And he came to her and looked at both envelopes and then at her. Open the Hargrove one first, she said. They're addressed to me. I know. Open the Hargrove one first. He almost smiled. He took both envelopes, sat on the grain chest by the wall, and opened the one from Hargrove. She watched his face while he read. He'd gotten good at keeping his face still. She'd observed that over the past weeks, the way his expression had default settings for public situations, and then occasionally slipped into something more unguarded when he didn't realize she was watching. But she'd also gotten good at reading the small things that got through the stillness, the slight tension around his eyes, the way his jaw moved when he was processing something complicated. He read it twice. Then he folded it and looked at the barn ceiling for a moment. "Hargrove believes me," he said. "That's good. He says the board has been aware of irregularities in the Eastern Route filing for 6 weeks but couldn't account for them. My documentation fills in what they were missing." He paused. "He wants me in the Capitol, in person. He says—" He stopped, read from the letter directly. "Your physical presence and testimony before the board is essential to any formal action. A letter, however well documented, can be challenged. You cannot." He folded it again. "He's right." "The Capitol," she said. "How far?" 4 days by horse if the South Pass is clear." "When does he need you?" "He's convened an emergency board session 2 weeks from now." He opened the second envelope. Read it faster because he already knew the shape of what he was looking for. "Celia Park. She's a land attorney." He scanned it. "She says the debt acquisition on your property may be legally challengeable because Consolidated Valley Holdings filed its banking commission registration fraudulently. They listed a capital reserve they don't have. If the registration is invalid, the debt transfer is invalid." He looked up. "She wants documentation of the acquisition timeline." "Which you have." "Which I have." He put both letters on his knee, and he sat there for a moment in the specific way of someone making a list in their head. Not writing it, just ordering it, placing everything where it needs to go before he starts moving. "You have to go," Rowan said. "Yes." "Eli can't make that ride in this weather." "No." He looked at the letters. "I was thinking, if you'd allow it, he could stay here, while I go to the Capitol." She'd been expecting this, and she'd already settled it in her own mind, but she made him wait a beat anyway because it was the kind of thing that deserved a beat. "You'd trust me with him," she said. "I trust you more than anyone I know," he said. "Which is a short list right now, but the statement is still true." She sat down on the opposite bench. "He's going to be furious." "Absolutely," Silas said. "He'll argue, he'll sulk for a day, and then he'll find something to take apart and reassemble and be fine." He paused. "He likes it here." "I know he does." A silence. It had a particular quality, the way silences between people who've been sharing a confined space for weeks develop a texture that silences between strangers don't have. "I'll be back," he said. Not defensive, just stating a fact he wanted on record. "I know you will," she said. Not reassuring, just acknowledging. "Rowan." He said her name the way he'd been saying it lately, not as a way of getting her attention, more like a word he was checking the weight of. "When this is done, when the board acts and Kane's operation is exposed and the debt on this property is resolved," he stopped. I want to." He stopped again, and she watched him, this man who spoke to railroad boards and calculated fraud schemes and managed his grief with a precision that occasionally broke her heart, fumbling for a sentence. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Not now," she said. "Say it when you come back." "Not before." He held her gaze, then he nodded. "All right," he said. Boasts. He told Eli that night. Rowan stayed at the stove and let them have it, pretending to be interested in the beans she was cooking. She heard Eli's voice go flat in the specific way it went flat when he was working very hard not to show something. "How long?" Eli said. 3 weeks? Maybe 4. "That's a long time." "I know." "The last time you left and said it would be a short time, Eli. You were gone 2 months, and when you came back you had a head wound." A pause from Silas. "That's fair?" "So how do I know this time "You don't," Silas said, and she heard in it the decision not to dress it up, not to make promises that depended on things outside his control. I can tell you what I'm planning, and I can tell you that what I'm doing is the opposite of running away from something. I'm going towards something to fix it. Another pause. And I'm leaving you with the most capable person I know on the most defensible piece of land in this range, and I need you to trust me. Eli was quiet for a moment. Are those the same thing? He said. Trusting you and knowing you'll come back? The silence that followed was the most honest silence Rowan had heard in the cabin. No, Silas said. They're not the same thing, but I'm asking for both. Another pause, then the sound of a chair scraping back, and small footsteps, and when Rowan glanced over her shoulder, she saw Eli had gotten up and put his arms around his father's neck in the compact, fierce way he had of doing things, not clinging, just holding on long enough to make it count, and then let go and went to wash his hands for dinner without looking at either of them. She turned back to the stove. Her eyes were doing something inconvenient, and she didn't particularly want an audience for it. Silas left before dawn 2 days later. He'd spent those 2 days doing 3 things with the focused efficiency she'd come to associate with him when something mattered: preparing his documentation for the board meeting, writing a detailed letter to Celia Park with the acquisition timeline and specific account numbers, and this he did quietly, without discussing it, settling $1,400 with the Territorial Bank through a wire transfer arranged via the Aldrin family's contact in the capital. She found out from Tom Aldrin, not from Silas. He asked me to send it yesterday, Tom said, when he came by with her supply order. Said to tell you it wasn't charity. Said to tell you, Tom squinted, remembering. Said to tell you it's the reckoning of a debt that was always his family's to pay. She stood in her kitchen and held the bank receipt that Tom had brought with it, and she thought about arguing with a man who wasn't there to argue with, which was so spectacularly pointless that after a moment she almost laughed. She put the receipt in the drawer under the almanacs and went to find Eli. He was in the barn. Of course he was. He'd been spending most of his time there since his father left, and she understood it. The barn was where the horses were, and the horses were the last thing his father had touched before riding out, and proximity to them was the closest thing available to proximity to the man himself. She understood this the way she understood it because she was a person who had spent 2 winters on a mountain talking to a dead man's fence posts. The bay wants exercise, she said from the door. I'm going to ride the north fence line this afternoon. You can come. He looked up from the stall gate he was examining with the diagnostic attention he'd inherited from someone. This latch isn't right, he said. I know. Your father said he'd get to it. I can fix it. She looked at him. 8 years old, with hay in his hair and his father's gray eyes, and a certainty about the latch that was probably correct. After the ride, she said. He came. Besides, they rode the north fence line in the late afternoon cold, taking their time, letting the horses set the pace. Eli sat his horse well, better than she'd expected for a child his age, with the easy seat of someone who'd been put on horseback early and often. He didn't chatter on the ride the way he sometimes did. He was quiet in the watchful way his father was quiet, taking in the land. They stopped at the highest point of the North Ridge. From there you could see down into the full valley. The dark tree lines, the white fields, the distant gray suggestions of other properties. Papa said this is why they want it, Eli said. He was looking south. The view, he means, the grade. He said whoever owns this ridge controls the whole approach. He's right. He knows a lot about how land and railroad connect. A pause. He used to know it for a different reason. Now he knows it because of people trying to take things. Rowan looked at him. Does that bother you, that the thing he knows got turned around like that? Eli thought about it. Genuinely, not just to say something. It bothers him, Eli said. He doesn't say so. But when he talks about what the company used to be, when his grandfather had it, when his father built it, he sounds like he's describing something that happened to someone else, like he's not sure he's allowed to claim it anymore. What do you think? I think it's still his, Eli said. The bad things that happened to it don't stop it from being his. He paused. That's what he told me about Mama. That just because she died didn't mean she stopped being mine. He turned his horse back toward the cabin trail. He's better at knowing the right thing to say than at believing it when it's about himself. Rowan turned Clara and followed. She didn't say anything, but she thought about it the whole ride back. 9 days after Silas left, Victor Kane made his third visit. This time he came alone. No riders, no document in hand, just himself on a dark horse at 11 in the morning, stopping at her gate and waiting there until she came out to meet him, which she did. She was not the kind of woman who let men wait at her gate and pretend they were being respectful. He looked different. The careful surface was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. A tightness around the jaw, something a little less settled in the eyes. "I'll be direct," he said. "Where is he?" "Where's who?" she said. He looked at her for a moment with the look of a man deciding not to bother with pretense. "The board convened 3 days early," he said. "Hargrove called an emergency session. I have been informed that a significant amount of documentation was presented and that the Eastern Route Acquisition Program has been suspended pending review." He paused. "Pending review means they're looking for more. They haven't acted yet. There's still time to manage this." "Manage it how?" she said. "The documentation can be challenged. It will be challenged. Chain of custody, authenticity, provenance, these things take time to establish in a formal proceeding, and time is something Silas Blackwood does not have." He leaned forward slightly on the saddle, and she saw the thing that had been underneath the patient surface the whole time. The urgency, the actual man behind the deployed manner. His brother has already filed a legal declaration contesting his legal status. A man officially recorded as deceased cannot give testimony, cannot present evidence, cannot own property. Before Silas can do anything with what he sent them, he has to spend months, possibly years, re-establishing his legal existence. She held his gaze. "That sounds like a problem for the courts to work out." "It's a problem that doesn't have to exist," Kane said. "If he withdraws the documentation, if this stops here, I can guarantee that the debt matter on your property is resolved. Fully resolved, retired, no further obligation. I can guarantee that no further approach is made to this land. And I can guarantee—" He paused. "I can guarantee that Silas Blackwood's situation resolves quietly. His existence is acknowledged. No legal challenge to his status. He walks away clean." She stood at her gate in the February cold, and she looked at Victor Kane, and she thought about what it had cost him to come here alone without his riders and offer her this. He was afraid, not of her, of what had already been set in motion. "He's not here," she said, "and even if he were, I wouldn't be the one to answer for him." "But you could reach him." "I could do a lot of things," she said. "I'm choosing not to do this one." The tightness in his jaw increased fractionally. "Miss Ashford, you understand what I'm telling you. If this goes to a full board hearing, if Donovan Blackwood's legal team gets involved at the federal level, this valley doesn't come out the same. The process alone will take years. Properties in dispute get frozen. People who have debts and timelines can't wait years." She thought about the Yarnells, the Crews, 2 families who hadn't been able to wait. "Is that a threat?" she said. "It's reality." "No," she said. "It's your version of reality. And your version has been wrong about this property from the beginning." He looked at her for a long moment. The surface came back, the careful practice surface, but she could see now what was under it. And what was under it was a man who had built his plan on the assumption that everyone would eventually calculate that standing firm cost more than giving in, and was encountering, for possibly the first time, people for whom that calculation simply didn't apply. "Think about it," he said. "I've thought about it," she said. He turned his horse. He rode down the south trail, and she watched him go. And she did not feel triumphant because she was too practical for that, and too aware that he'd been right about one thing. The process was going to be long, and it was going to be hard, and there were no guarantees at the end of it. But she had made her choice a long time ago. The night she opened the door, she went inside and wrote a letter to Silas at the address Hargrove had sent for him at the Capitol, telling him about Kane's visit and the content of the offer, keeping it factual, keeping it clear. She sealed it and left it for Tom Aldrin's next run. Then she went to find Eli, because the latch on the stall gate still needed fixing, and she'd promised him he could. What happened next happened faster than she'd expected, and in a direction she hadn't fully predicted. 12 days after Silas left, Martin Aldrin, Tom's father, A man of 53 who had ranched this valley for 30 years and said very little in public unless he had decided it was time to say it, came to her property on foot. He walked the 6 miles from his place in the cold because, he said, he didn't want anyone to see his horse at her gate. He sat at her kitchen table and he told her that he'd heard what Kane had offered through a chain of information she didn't ask him to detail. And he told her that Gus Hartwell, who had 300 acres on the West Flat and whose wife was not well and whose debt situation was not good, had been approached by Kane the same week and had been shown a document suggesting that the Ashford Ranch debt had been resolved because Rowan had agreed to a quiet sale and was just waiting on final paperwork. "He's using your name," Martin Aldrin said. His voice was even, but there was something in it, a controlled anger that had been building for a while and was finding its direction. "Telling the valley you're selling so the holdouts think they're the last one standing." Rowan stared at him. "Gus knows me. He knows I'd tell him myself if I were selling. Gus is scared. Scared men believe what reduces the fear." She stood up. "What does Gus need to hear?" "He needs to hear it from you, directly." Martin paused. "And maybe he's not the only one." She looked at him. "You're talking about going to the other ranchers. The ones Kane's been working on, the ones who are scared and close to giving in." Martin turned his hat in his hands, the gesture of a man who has something to say and is making sure he has the right words for it. "There are 8 families left in this valley who haven't sold. 6 of them are people I've known for 20 years. They're good people with real problems, and a man who is very good at finding exactly the pressure point that makes each of those problems feel unsurvivable." He stopped. "If someone who has already said no to Victor Kane stood up in front of those families and told them what you know, about the fraud, about the root, about what the land is actually worth, it might change the arithmetic." Rowan thought about what Silas had said weeks ago. The position you speak from matters. A man can have all the evidence in the world, and if he's isolated, it doesn't matter. It wasn't just true for men. "Set it up," she said. Martin blinked, apparently having expected more resistance. "There's a meeting place, the old Harker barn on the East Road, neutral ground. Nobody owns it currently. It's been empty since the Harkers sold 3 years ago." He paused. 2 days from now, if you're willing." 2 days? She said. "Yes." And Martin, "Yeah." "Bring Gus yourself. Don't send word. Go get him." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He stood up, and before he left, he said, "My father bought this valley's first property 40 years ago, paid fair price, and worked fair, and expected the same from anyone who came after." He paused at the door. "I have not been willing to accept that the last chapter of this valley is written by Victor Kane." He walked back out into the cold, and Rowan listened to his footsteps on the porch boards until they were gone. Then she sat down and thought very carefully about what she was going to say to 8 scared families in an empty barn in 2 days, and she thought about it the way she thought about everything, practically, honestly, without telling herself it was simpler than it was. The Harker barn held 16 people and one 8-year-old boy who had been told to sit in the corner and be quiet, and was doing so with the focused attention of someone filing everything for later use. Eli had insisted on coming. She had made a list in her head of reasons to leave him with the Aldrins for the evening, and then looked at his face and understood that leaving him behind would communicate something she didn't intend to communicate, and she'd let him come. It was cold in the barn. People stood in their coats, and their breath came out in small clouds, and they looked at Rowan Ashford with the faces of people who were tired and worried and not sure whether they'd come here to find hope or to hear that it was time to give up. She knew what that looked like. She'd worn it herself, some mornings, over 2 winters. She didn't start with the fraud. She started with the land. "Your property is worth more than what Kane is offering," she said. "Not a little more. Significantly more. The reason is the railroad route, and the reason you don't know about the route is that the consortium acquired that information through a fraudulent arrangement with the railroad company's management, and they've been using it to buy low before the announcement makes prices rise." She paused. "I have documentation of all of this. Letters, account transfers, acquisition records. That documentation is currently before the railroad board." The room was quiet. "Gus," she said, looking at the man Martin had brought. He was 50-something, with the face of someone who hadn't slept well in months. Victor Kane told you I'd agreed to sell. I haven't. I'm standing here. My land is mine. And I need you to understand that the story he told you was a lie he used to make you feel alone. Because isolated people are easier to pressure than people who talk to each other. Gus looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. His face had something in it that had been covered over for a while. He sent someone to the bank, Gus said. Said my loan was being reviewed. Said there might be concerns about the terms. That's his standard approach, Rowan said. He did the same to me. But here's what he can't do. He cannot legally accelerate a debt that was acquired through a fraudulent company registration. Celia Park, a land attorney in the capital, is challenging the registration of Consolidated Valley Holdings on exactly those grounds. A woman near the back, Rowan didn't know her well, she was from one of the South Flat properties, said, "How long does that take?" "Longer than we want," Rowan said. "I'm not going to lie to you about that. What I'm telling you is that it's happening, and that while it's happening, the worst thing we can do is sell. Because the moment we sell, the legal challenge has no one to protect." Martin Aldrin spoke from his place near the door. What she's not saying, because she's not a boastful woman, is that she said no to Kane 3 times and she's still standing. "And Kane came to me twice because of it," Rowan said, "which tells you what saying no actually costs him." The room shifted. She could feel it. Not a decision, not yet, but the particular shift in a group of people when the story they've been living in starts to look like it has a different ending than the one they'd accepted. A man named Rudy, from the North Parcel, said that this man, the one with the documentation, Silas Blackwood, where is he? "In the Capitol," Rowan said, "in front of the railroad board." Can we trust him? She thought about a fence post set deeper than she'd managed herself. A child who woke up and pulled his father out of a burning building. A man who stood on her porch and spoke his own name out loud for the first time in months and didn't flinch. "He is the reason this is happening at all," she said. "He could have kept running. He chose not to." She paused. "That's the only answer I have for whether you can trust someone." Rudy nodded slowly. He looked at his wife. Some exchange happened between them that didn't require words. "I'm not signing anything for Kane," he said. "Not while this is still moving." One by one, around the barn, the others said their piece. Not all of them were certain. Gus was still scared. She could see it, and she didn't try to talk him out of it, because fear is honest and deserves to be respected. But by the time the meeting ended, 6 of the 8 families in that barn had made the same decision: to hold, to wait, to see what the railroad board did. It was not a victory. She was careful not to call it one. It was a position, a place to stand from. She drove back to the property in the dark with Eli beside her, and he was quiet for the first mile. And then he said, "You talk to them like they were smart." "They are smart," she said. "A lot of people don't do that," he said. "Talk to scared people like they're still smart." She looked at the dark trail ahead. "Your father does." "Yeah," Eli said. "He does." They rode in silence for a while. The mountain was dark and cold around them, and above it the stars were the particular thick, uninterrupted stars you only get on a clear winter night at altitude. And Rowan thought about standing on her porch 2 months ago, wondering whether this land was still worth holding. The answer had not gotten simpler, but it had gotten clearer. Silas's first letter arrived 4 days later. It was short, because he was not a man who wrote at length when he didn't have space or time for it. He told her the board session had been postponed once, convened, and then recessed for 48 hours while board members reviewed documents independently. He told her that Hargrove was solid, and that the second man, a board member named Weston, had been harder to read but had asked the right questions. He told her that Donovan's lawyers had arrived and filed 3 separate challenges to the documentation's provenance on the first day. And at the end, in handwriting slightly different from the rest, slightly less controlled, like something written quickly or in a different state of mind, he wrote, "Eli is all right, I know. Tell him the horses are the reason I get up in the morning. He'll know what I mean." She read that last line twice. Then she folded the letter and put it in the drawer with the bank receipt. She went to find Eli. He was in the barn. The stall gate latch was fixed, had been fixed for a week, perfectly, cleanly, with a modification to the original design that made it open easier in cold weather. He was now examining the pulley system on the hay lift with the look of someone who had identified the next problem. "Letter from your father," she said. He turned around fast. The only time he moved fast, she'd noticed, was when that sentence was coming. She gave it to him. He read it standing up, all of it, and when he got to the last line, something happened in his face that he covered quickly, but not quite quickly enough. "The horses," he said. He said you'd know what he meant. Eli looked at the letter for a moment. "When Mama died," he said, "he stopped for a while. Just stopped. He didn't eat right. He didn't sleep right. He'd go out to the barn in the middle of the night and just stand there." He folded the letter. "I asked him once what he was doing. He said the horses were the only thing that made sense, because they needed the same things every day and they didn't ask him to be anything he couldn't be right then." He looked at Rowan. "He started coming back after that. A little at a time." She didn't say anything. "He's saying he's coming back," Eli said. "That's what the letter means." She looked at this boy. This serious, precise, entirely himself boy who had pulled his father out of a burning building and crossed a mountain in a blizzard and spent 2 months fixing every broken thing he could find on a stranger's ranch, while his father went to fight a battle that was too large and too complicated for an 8-year-old to be allowed to watch. "I know," she said. He tucked the letter inside his coat close to him. "The pulley needs a new rope," he said. "The one it has is fraying at the connection point." She looked at the pulley. He was right. "I have rope in the back of the supply shed," she said. "I'll show you which one." She walked with him toward the shed, and the cold settled around them both. And somewhere to the south, 4 days' ride away in a heated room with documents on the table and men who had her name somewhere in their files, the thing that was going to determine the shape of all their futures was still in motion, still unresolved, still entirely possible to lose. She knew that. She held it, the way you hold something heavy, not pretending it's light, just deciding you're strong enough to carry it until you don't have to anymore. And she showed Eli which rope to use, and they went back to the barn together, and the afternoon got on with itself the way afternoons do. The second letter came 6 days after the first. It was longer this time, and she could tell from the handwriting, steadier, more deliberate, that he'd had time to sit down properly when he wrote it. He told her the board had reconvened after its 48-hour recess, and that Weston, the harder man to read, had come back with 37 specific questions about the account documentation, which Silas said was a good sign because a man who prepares 37 questions has already decided the material is worth taking seriously. He told her Donovan had shown up on the second day of the reconvened session. Not to testify, his lawyers had kept him out of the room, but he'd been in the corridor and Silas had seen him through the glass panel of the hearing room door, and they'd looked at each other for a moment that Silas described, in the letter, as the strangest 30 seconds of his life. His brother had aged, he wrote. Or maybe I just hadn't looked at him straight in a long time and aging isn't the right word. He looked like a man who knows the ground is moving under him and has decided the only play left is to look like he doesn't notice. She read that line 3 times. Then he wrote, Celia Park argued the Consolidated Valley Holdings registration challenge before the Territorial Banking Commission yesterday. She is extremely good at her job, the kind of good that makes the other side's lawyers look physically uncomfortable. I thought you should know because I know you were the one who gave her the acquisition timeline documents. And at the end, tell Eli I'll be home by the end of the month. I know that sounds like the kind of thing fathers say. I mean it the way I say things. I mean, home. He'd written home. She folded the letter carefully and set it in the drawer, on top of the bank receipt and the first letter, and she stood in her kitchen for a moment with her hand flat on the drawer front, and she let herself feel the specific complicated thing that word meant in this context. A man who had arrived with nothing, and a head wound and a borrowed name referring to her cabin on her mountain as the place he was coming back to. She made coffee. She had a ranch to run. Eli read the second letter in the barn, the same way he'd read the first one, standing, quickly, holding it with both hands. When he got to the end, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, End of the month is 9 days. That's right, Rowan said. He looked at the letter. He said home. I noticed. Eli folded it slowly. He was doing something with his face that he'd gotten from his father. The careful management of an expression that wanted to do something he hadn't given it permission to do yet. "Is that all right with you?" he said. That he said that. She looked at him. 8 years old, asking her permission for something that was his father's word in his father's letter, because he understood already, this serious, perceptive boy, that words like that have weight that lands on more than one person. "It's all right with me," she said. He nodded. Something in him settled. "The pulley rope held," he said, moving toward the hay lift with the focused energy of a person who has just resolved something and is ready to move on to the next thing. "I can see that," she said. 9 days later, it was snowing again. Not a blizzard. The particular soft, unhurried snow of late winter that falls without any intention of killing you, just reminding you that the season isn't finished yet. Eli had been checking the South Trail every hour since noon, which she'd let him do because there was no point telling a 9-year-old. He'd turned 9 3 days ago, quietly, with a cake she'd made from what she had and a book she'd found in the supply exchange in Harlan that had kept him absorbed for an entire evening. That watching a trail doesn't make someone arrive faster. It doesn't, but it makes the waiting feel like doing something, and that has its own value. She was in the barn at 4 in the afternoon checking the water trough when she heard Eli shout. Not a frightened shout. The other kind. The particular high, involuntary shout of a child who has just seen something he's been waiting on. She came out of the barn. He was already running down the trail, coat half buttoned, hat somewhere behind him in the snow, running with the complete physical commitment of someone who has decided that the distance between himself and what he wants should not exist anymore. The rider coming up the trail stopped his horse and got down, and Eli hit him at a full sprint, and Silas caught him the same way he'd caught him that first morning in the storm. One arm out, absorbing the impact, pulling the boy in, and they stood in the falling snow on her trail and held on. She stayed where she was. There are things you don't interrupt. She gave it a full minute. Then she started walking down the trail, taking her time, because she was a practical woman and she had about 100 things to say and she wanted to pick them in the right order. Silas looked up when she got close. He was thinner. The capital, the hearings, the weeks of sitting in rooms with lawyers and documents had taken something out of him that the ranch work had put in, and she noted this the way she noted things, clinically, as something that would be addressed. He had a bruise at his jaw that was 3 or 4 days old and going yellow at the edges, which she also noted and filed for later. He looked at her over Eli's head. "I said end of the month," he said. "You're 2 days early," she said. "I wanted to be accurate," he said. "In case something delayed me, I'd rather be early than late." "Practical," she said. "I learned it from someone." She stopped in front of him. Eli had his face buried against his father's coat and showed no signs of moving. "The bruise," she said. He touched his jaw. Donovan's lawyers held a press conference on day 3 and suggested that the documentation had been fabricated by a man with a mental instability stemming from grief. My response was not entirely verbal. She looked at him. "I hit a lawyer," he said. "Which one?" "The one who said it loudest." She considered this for a moment. Was it worth it? He thought about it honestly. Probably not strategically. Yes, personally. "And the board?" "Hargrove sent me out of the room for an hour. When I came back, Weston had moved. I don't know if those two things are related." He paused. The vote was 4-2 in favor of formal suspension of the Eastern Route Acquisition Program and referral of the fraud evidence to the federal level. She was quiet for a moment, processing it. 4-2. Not unanimous, never as clean as you'd want it. "Kane," she said, "is currently subject to a federal inquiry into the banking registration fraud. His land acquisitions in the valley are frozen pending investigation. He can't sell, can't transfer, can't leverage any of it." A pause. Celia Park filed her challenge on the same day the board voted. The Consolidated Valley Holdings registration was voided 4 days later. "The debt acceleration on your property is legally invalid." She breathed in slowly. "Let it out." "And Donovan," she said. His face did the thing, the careful thing. Donovan resigned from the company the morning after the vote, before the federal referral was formalized. He's retained lawyers and he's going to fight it, and it's going to take time. He paused. He's not in jail, not yet. Maybe not ever. Men with that much money are very good at paying the cost of accountability in ways that don't involve cells. His voice held something that wasn't quite bitterness and wasn't quite acceptance, something in between that doesn't really have a name. What I can say is that he cannot do what he was doing anymore. The mechanism is broken. And the company... He stopped. The company, she prompted. The board has asked me to resume operational oversight during the transition, not full control. There's a trust structure now, independent board majority, safeguards my father never thought he'd need. He looked at the mountain behind her. It's not the company my father built. It's something different, something that has to earn its shape again. He looked at her. I said I'd consider it. I didn't say yes yet. She looked at him steadily. Why not? Because yes means the capital, he said. Headquarters, lawyers and board meetings, and a life that looks like... He stopped. It means leaving. For how long? I don't know. Initially, months, to stabilize things. He shifted his hold on Eli, who had gone quiet in the particular way of a child who is listening without appearing to. But there are things I need to know first, before I decide. She held his gaze. The snow was coming down soft and steady between them. You said you'd say it when you came back, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I'd like to come back. After the capital, whatever that takes and however long. I'd like to come back here. If that's... He stopped. Tried again. If that's what you want. She thought about 2 winters alone on a mountain. She thought about the morning she'd found the wood stacked under the cover and understood something about herself she hadn't known before. She thought about Eli fixing the stall latch and reading almanacs and asking if it was all right that his father had used the word home. She was not a woman who said things she didn't mean, and she was not a woman who wrapped what she meant in softer language to make it easier to say. I opened the door, she said. I already told you what that means. He held her eyes. She watched the thing that happened in his face, not relief, which would have been too easy, but something more like a weight that had been held at a particular angle for a long time finally finding its balance. Eli pulled back from his father's coat enough to look up at both of them. Are you doing the thing where you say important things in short sentences? He said. Yes, Rowan said. Is it done? Almost, Silas said. Eli put his face back against the coat. Tell me when it's done. Hokyam. He stayed for 3 weeks before going back to the capital. They were not easy weeks exactly. Nothing about the practical reality of the situation was easy. The federal inquiry into Kane's operations meant that the Yarnell and Crew properties were frozen in legal limbo, their fates tied to the timeline of an investigation that moved at the speed of federal bureaucracy, which is to say slowly and with many forms. Gus Hartwell's bank situation required Celia Park's direct intervention to stabilize, which she provided, but it took time and it was not certain until it was. 2 of the 8 families from the Harker barn meeting had their debt situations resolved within the month. The other 6 took longer, in varying degrees, because that is the nature of anything broken by human corruption. It does not unbreak in the same amount of time it took to break. But the weeks had their own texture, their own dailiness, and that dailiness was what she remembered afterward when she thought about that particular period of her life. Silas worked the ranch the way he'd worked it before, without being asked, without announcing it, but differently now, because the not announcing had changed its nature. Before, he'd worked quietly to justify his presence in someone else's space. Now he worked the way a person works on something they have a stake in, and the difference was visible in the quality of attention he brought to it. He spent 2 days on the structural assessment of the North Barn and came to dinner on the second night with a list of what needed to happen in what order to take the building from functional to genuinely sound. She looked at the list. It was thorough. It was also the work of the next 2 years. This is a long list, she said. It's a lot of barn, he said. You know you're going back to the capital for months. I know. This is a list for after. He looked at it, turned it so she could see his notes in the margin. Some of it can wait. The foundation on the southwest corner can't. That needs to be done before the next freeze or you'll lose that wall section. He paused. I can do the foundation before I go. If we start tomorrow, Eli will want to help. Eli already redesigned the drain system. He pulled another piece of paper from his pocket. He did it last week while I was reviewing documents. He didn't tell me. He just drew it out and left it on the table. She looked at Eli's drawing. It was precise. The logic of it was sound. He gets it from someone, she said. Silas was quiet for a moment. He gets it from himself, he said. Whatever he inherited, he made it into something that's his. She looked at Silas across the table, and she understood that he meant that to be about Eli, and also, underneath it, about himself. About the company and the name and the history that had been twisted by his brother's choices, and was now being made into something different. Something that still bore the shape of what it had been, but was being held by different hands, in a different spirit, with an accounting of what it owed that his father had never written, but that Silas was writing now. The Southwest Barn Corner got done in 3 days. Eli was involved in every hour of it, handing tools, asking questions, periodically disappearing to recalculate something and coming back with a correction that was, about half the time, actually correct. On the last evening, before Silas left, the three of them ate dinner at the kitchen table without talking much, which had become their normal. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who don't feel required to fill space with sound. After dinner, Eli went to bed early, which surprised Rowan until she realized he'd done it deliberately to give them the evening, and she thought, 9 years old. 9. She and Silas sat by the stove with coffee, and outside the late winter wind moved through the pine trees with a sound that was nothing like the sound it had made the night he'd knocked on her door. That night it had sounded like something hostile. Now it just sounded like weather. The first morning, he said, after the storm, you came into the barn and found me looking at the fence post. I remember. You didn't ask me to leave, he said. You asked me if I knew horses. I needed to know if you were useful. I know. He turned his cup in his hands. It wasn't how I expected someone to respond to a stranger in their barn at 6 a.m. I'd already decided I wasn't going to throw you out, she said. I was just figuring out what to do with you. He almost smiled. And what did you decide? That you were going to be trouble, she said. I was right. Yes, he said. I'm sorry about that part. I'm not, she said. He looked at her. She held his gaze without difficulty because she meant it, and she'd gotten past the age of pretending she didn't mean things. I was thinking about leaving, she said, before you came. Not because of Kane. I didn't know about Kane. Just because I wasn't sure anymore why I was staying. She looked at the stove. I'd been telling myself it was the ranch, the land, what my husband and I had built. But the truth is my husband and I hadn't been in agreement about this place for the last year before he died. He wanted to sell and move south. I wanted to stay. She paused. When he died, staying felt like, I don't know, like I owed it to him even though he hadn't wanted it. Which is a strange kind of debt to carry. Silas was quiet, listening. What you said on the porch, she said, that night in the storm, that you were looking for somewhere to stop, just for a minute, just to stop. She paused. I'd forgotten that was allowed. Being in a place without having a reason for it beyond, it's where you are and it's enough. Did you find it? He said. What you were looking for? She thought about it honestly. I found out the ranch was worth fighting for, she said. That's different from what I was looking for, but it's better. He nodded. What were you looking for? She said. When you knocked on the door. He was quiet for a moment. Safety, he said. Just one night of not running. That was all I wanted. He looked at the stove. I didn't know yet that I was looking for anything else. And now? He looked at her. Now I know what else looks like, he said, which makes the capital easier to go back to and harder to stay in. She understood this. She understood it in a specific way. The particular clarifying effect of knowing what you're returning to, how it makes the leaving more bearable because the leaving is no longer open-ended. You are not leaving, you are doing something you need to do before you come back. Eli's enrolled in school, she said. It was a practical statement. She'd arranged it with the schoolteacher in Harlan 2 weeks ago because a 9-year-old needed to be around other 9-year-olds occasionally, and the trip into town twice a week was good for both of them. I know, he said. He told me he corrected the teacher on a calculation problem. He was right about the calculation. That's what he said. He's also learning that being right is not the same as being well received, she said, which is a harder lesson, and he's working on it. Silas looked at the ceiling for a moment, the expression of a parent confronting a trait he recognizes from the inside. He'll learn it, he said. He will, she agreed. They sat by the stove until the fire burned down, and it was the most ordinary evening she could remember in a long time, which was exactly the right way to describe it. Ordinary, in the specific sense of something that belongs to your life rather than happening to it. He left in the morning. Eli was up early, earlier than Rowan, which almost never happened, and she came out to find him already in the barn, checking the tack on his father's horse with the systematic care of someone who needs their hands to be doing something they understand. She left them to it. She made coffee, and she stood at the window and she watched through the glass as Silas took his time going over the horse, as Eli handed him things, as they talked in the low-register way they talked when it was just the two of them. Not quiet because of sadness, just quiet because some conversations don't need volume. When the horse was ready, Silas came into the cabin for his coat and his bags. The southwest corner, she said, should hold through next winter. Check it in September. I know when to check it. I know you do. He picked up his bag. He looked around the kitchen, the stove, the shelf of almanacs, the jar of dried sage on the windowsill that Eli had reorganized twice since they arrived because he thought the arrangement was inefficient. His face held the particular expression of a person memorizing something. Silas, she said. He looked at her. The company, she said, when you stabilize it. When you do whatever has to be done to make it into what it should be. Don't lose track of why your father built it. He held her gaze. Which part? The part where a man with 2 engines and a promissory note on borrowed land decided the work was worth doing, she said. Not the size of it, the reason for it. He was quiet for a moment. I'll remember, he said. See that you do. He picked up his bag and walked to the door, and she followed him out, because the appropriate response to someone leaving is to watch them go, not to turn away before they're out of sight. He mounted up, and Eli stood at the porch rail and watched, and Silas looked at them both. 4 months, he said. Maybe less. We'll be here, Eli said. Silas looked at Rowan. We'll be here, she said. He rode south. She and Eli stood on the porch and watched until the trail bent through the tree line and took him out of sight. And then they stood a moment longer because sometimes that's what you do. Then Eli said, What needs doing today? She looked at him. 9 years old, borrowed coat, his father's eyes, a calculation about drain systems in his pocket. Feedstock, she said. After that, the east fence section needs walking. I noticed a post on the far end that might be healing over, he said. So did I, she said. Bring the driver. He went to get it. She went to get her coat. 4 months became 5, which she'd half expected. The federal inquiry moved the way federal inquiries move, and the untangling of Donovan Blackwood's arrangements with Victor Kane's consortium was, as Silas wrote in his 3rd letter and his 4th and his 5th, considerably more complex than the initial documentation had suggested. More money had moved through more accounts to more places than even Silas had known about. Kane's operation in this valley had been one piece of a larger pattern that stretched across 3 territories and at least a dozen land schemes. She read all of this in letters that arrived with Tom Aldrin on his twice-monthly runs, and she answered them, and she told him about the east fence post that had in fact been healing and required resetting, and about Eli's ongoing negotiation with the schoolteacher in Harlan, and about Clara throwing a shoe in March and the farrier from 6 miles out who had fixed it but charged twice what it was worth, and about the way the mountain looked in the particular light of early April when the snow was finally thinking about giving up. She wrote him ordinary things because that was what she had to offer and what she believed he needed. The texture of a life going on, the evidence that the place he'd said home about was still there and still itself. He wrote back in kind. Between the updates on the inquiry and the board and the lawyers, he wrote about the Capitol, the noise of it, the specific exhaustion of spending your days in rooms where everything is argument. He wrote about a restaurant near the hotel where the cook made a particular kind of soup that Eli would argue was inferior to what Rowan made, and he had no idea if that was true, but he thought Eli should know he'd thought of it. She read that sentence to Eli at the kitchen table. Eli ate his soup with slightly increased dignity. He came back on a Tuesday in late May, which is the kind of day Montana offers as an apology for winter. Warm enough to work without a coat, the mountain showing its actual colors under the retreated snow, the light staying later in the way that always surprised her, even though she'd seen it every year of her life. She was mending fence on the east line when she heard the horse. She didn't stop what she was doing. She finished the wire splice she was in the middle of, set down the tool, and then turned around. He came up the trail without hurrying, the way he'd moved on the property from the very beginning, like a man who has calculated his relationship to the space around him and is at ease with it. He was less thin than when he'd come back from the capital the first time. There was something in his face that had not been there before, or had been there and covered, a settledness. Not happiness, which is temporary and weather-dependent, but something more structural than that. He stopped his horse at the fence section she was working on. "The splice is uneven," he said, looking at the wire. "I know," she said. "I was in a hurry." "You're never in a hurry." "I heard a horse." He got down. They stood on opposite sides of the fence line for a moment, which was appropriate in its way. The literal boundary of her property between them, the piece of ground that had been the cause and center of everything. And here they were on either side of it in late May, with the mountain showing its best colors and the work half done around them. "Is it settled?" she said. "The inquiry is ongoing," he said. "It will be for a while yet. Donovan has enough lawyers to keep it complicated for years." He paused. "But the Valley acquisitions are voided, formally, permanently. The families who were pressured have their properties clear. The Yarnell place, the daughter's family is coming back. They decided to come back." She thought about the Yarnell place, dark all winter. "And Kane?" "Indicted on 4 counts of banking fraud. His consortium's assets are frozen. He's not going to prison tomorrow, but he's not doing anything else either." He paused. "He's going to spend the rest of his life in legal proceedings, which is, in some ways, exactly what he deserves." "And the company?" "Has a new operational director who is not me," he said. "I put the transition in place 6 weeks ago. There's an independent board, a new director who knows the operations and doesn't have a family stake, and a trust structure that makes what Donovan did structurally impossible going forward." He paused. "My father's company is not the same as it was, but it's not what it became under Donovan either. It's something that has to earn itself." He looked at her. "I'm not going back." She held his gaze. "You're sure?" "I'm sure of very few things," he said. I'm sure of this." She looked at the splice in the wire. Then she looked back at him. "Come over here and fix this," she said, "since you can apparently see from 20 feet away that it's uneven." He stepped over the fence, not through the gate, over it, the way someone steps over something that is technically a boundary but is not actually keeping them out. And he crouched beside the wire and looked at it the way he'd looked at the fence post that first morning in the barn. "You went too fast at the second rap," he said. "I told you I heard a horse." He looked up at her. The morning light was doing something specific to the mountains behind them. That particular angle that makes the peaks look closer than they are. And she thought, this is the picture. Not the dramatic moments, not the storm or the confrontation at the gate or the words on the porch. This. A man crouching by a fence line on a Tuesday in May, pointing out where the wire went wrong, with the mountain behind him and the whole long work of the day ahead. "Hand me the tool," he said. She handed it to him. Check. Eli came home from school that afternoon to find his father's horse in the barn. She heard him from the cabin, heard the running footsteps, heard the way they stopped when he registered the horse, heard the pause, and then heard him say his father's name in a voice that had lost every bit of the careful management he'd been applying to his emotions for 5 months. She stayed in the kitchen. Some things you give people the room to have. Later, when the barn had gone quiet and the supper was almost ready and the light outside was doing the long golden thing it does in Montana on late May evenings, Eli came into the cabin with hay in his hair and his father behind him, and he sat at the kitchen table and told her 3 things that had happened at school that week with the accelerated delivery of a person who has been saving things up for someone specific, things he'd been keeping in a folder in his mind under the label for later. for when he's back. She listened to all of it. She asked the right questions. She put supper on the table. And at some point during the meal, she wasn't sure exactly when, because the transition was not marked. It just happened the way things that are right tend to happen, without announcement. The three of them fell into the particular rhythm that she would understand later as the rhythm of a family. Not a perfect one, not a smooth one. One with a 9-year-old who corrected people too often, and a man who held things inside too long, and a woman who was better at practical problems than emotional ones, and who had spent 2 years using solitude as armor without fully understanding that was what she was doing. Imperfect, specific, entirely real. After supper, Eli asked if he could show his father the drain system redesign for the barn, and Silas said yes, and the two of them went out with a lamp and she cleared the table, and she thought about what it meant that this was what she'd chosen. Not a solution, not a conclusion, but a life. The ongoing, inconvenient, sometimes grinding, frequently beautiful thing that a life actually is. She'd opened the door expecting nothing. Expecting trouble, if she was honest. Expecting that she'd send them off in the morning and go back to the particular solitude she'd constructed for herself out of necessity and pride. She had not expected this, but there was something she'd learned in the months between that stormy door and this quiet kitchen. The things that matter almost never announce themselves properly. They knock in the middle of a blizzard, and they look like problems, and they take months to become what they actually are. And by the time you understand what you're looking at, it has already changed everything about the ground you're standing on. She looked out the window at the lamp moving through the dark toward the barn. 2 figures, one taller, one quick and purposeful, and the mountain behind them holding everything the way mountains do, indifferent to your plans and your grief and your small daily courage, indifferent to all of it, and also somehow the container for all of it. She'd held this ground, not because she was certain, not because she'd known what was coming, but because on the night she'd had to decide, she'd chosen to open the door. That was the whole of it. Everything else had followed from that. The following spring, Martin Aldrin organized the first Valley Cooperative. 8 families pooling resources for shared supply runs, shared legal counsel through Celia Park's office, and shared negotiation with whatever railroad interests came next, because railroads were not going away, and neither were the men who wanted to profit from them. And the best answer to that was not isolation, but people who talked to each other and showed up for each other and refused to be made to feel alone. Rowan was not the leader of this. She would have been bad at leading it, and she knew it. She was better one-on-one than in groups, better with practical problems than with the management of collective anxiety. Martin was better at the group part. She helped where she could and stayed out of it where she couldn't. Silas provided the legal framework, working with Celia Park to establish a land protection structure that made the kind of debt manipulation Kane had used significantly harder to execute. He did this from the property, riding into Harlan when he needed the telegraph and coming home. And that word had settled into ordinary use by now, without ceremony, just the word they used, in the evenings. The North Barn got the foundation work it needed that summer. Eli was involved in every day of it, and by the end had taught himself a version of basic engineering by doing it rather than reading it, which was the way he learned best. He started teaching himself to read surveying maps in the fall. Nobody asked him to. He just found one in the supply exchange in Harlan and started at it, and within a month he was pointing out things about the property lines that neither Rowan nor Silas had fully mapped. "He's going to be a problem," Silas said one evening, watching their son through the window. "He already is," Rowan said. "He's just our problem now." Their son. She'd said it without deciding to, without ceremony. Silas looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them made a thing of it, because it wasn't a thing that needed making. It was just a sentence that told the truth about what had already been true for a while. Outside, Eli was measuring something against the fence line, lips moving, working it out. The mountain behind him was doing what mountains do, staying, holding, indifferent and permanent, and somehow on evenings like this, on a property like this one, not indifferent at all. The door had opened on a winter night 2 years ago. Everything since had been what came through it. Not easy, not smooth, not what any of them had planned for, but built the way things worth keeping are built, slowly, honestly, by people who showed up for the work even on the days when they weren't sure it was worth doing. It was worth doing. It had always been worth doing.